What on earth do Dwarves and Ents have in common? My name's Rainbow Dave, and welcome to another video in our Lords of Beleriand series. So in today's video, we will continue the story of the Dwarves and look specifically at the Dwarves who journeyed to Beleriand, the Dwarves of the First Age, the two Dwarven clans of the Silmarillion. But before I get to them, I do first want to talk a little bit about a different race in Middle-earth, the sort of adopted step-siblings of the Dwarves. So the way I began the last video was by talking all about the divine origins of the Dwarves and how they were created by the Valar Aule, one of the gods of Arda, the lord of rock and earth and crafting. And so to begin this video, I'll talk about a little kind of sequel to that story, which focuses on the creations of Aule's wife, the Valier Yavanna, the queen of fruits and trees and all things that grow. And Aule and Yavanna are kind of a bit of an odd couple. On the one hand, they're kind of opposites, but on the other hand, they actually complement each other really, really well. In fact, there's a beautiful line in the Silmarillion where Yavanna is compared to moss upon stone. And I just think that's a really great visual metaphor for the relationship between Aule and Yavanna. Anyway, if you recall, Aule created the Dwarves in secret. Although, after they were made, he opened his mind to Yavanna, and so she became the first being outside of Aule, and of course Eru Ilúvatar, to know that dwarves even existed. And although Yavanna was happy for Aule, her heart grew anxious, and she prophesied that because the creation of the dwarves had been kept from her at first, their race would forever love first the things that they made by their own hands, and will have little love for the things of my love. Many a tree shall feel the bite of their iron without pity. Now, to this, Aule actually makes a really, really good point. He says that even without the dwarves, even if the dwarves never existed, the races of elves and men would also fell trees for building, and they'd also hunt animals for food. And so, Yavanna goes to the king of the Valar, Manwë, and without in any way betraying the confidence of her husband, she asks Manwë, "Shall nothing that I have devised be free from the dominion of others?" And to this, Manwë basically asks her, if you could have your way, what would you want? And Yavanna gives a really well thought out answer. So first, Yavanna draws a distinction between the Kelevar, which is just an elven word for animals or living things that move, and the Olivar, which are plants or growing things with roots in the earth. And she acknowledges that the Kelevar are not entirely defenseless, as they can run and they can fight, but the Olivar have no means of doing the same. And Yavanna specifically states that of all the Olivar, the thing she holds most dear are the trees. And this is where we actually see a bit of Tolkien's personality shining through in his writing. Because, as you may or may not be aware, Tolkien absolutely loved trees. Like, definitely more than the average person. And there's interviews of him as an old man walking around the grounds of what I assume is Oxford University, I don't know. And Tolkien just keeps stopping to talk all about the trees. You can kind of hear in the interviewer's voice that he wants to talk to Tolkien about, his academic works or his writings, but no. Tolkien just keeps stopping to talk about trees. He absolutely loved them.
I'm enormously attracted by trees. All my works is full of trees. I suppose I have actually, in some simple-minded form of longing, actually would like to. I should have liked to be able to make contact with a tree and find out what it feels about things. Trees, a lot of trees have gone, big trees from there, you see. There's much more woody, and there was a long line of trees, this guy nearly younger, all along the wall, so those houses couldn't see you and you couldn't see them when they were in leaf. Yes. It was a much more secluded garden.
Anyway, getting back to Yavanna, she says something really poignant about trees too. She says that they are long in the growing, swift shall they be in the felling, and unless they pay toll with fruit upon bough, little mourned in their passing. Would that the trees might speak on behalf of all things that have roots, and punish those that wrong them. And if this sounds familiar to you, that's because this is of course the origin of the Ents. Luckily for Yavanna, Eru Ilúvatar had already perceived her desire, and he'd already woven it into the Song of Creation, the Ainu Lindale. And so, after Yavanna's conversation with Manwë, Eru Ilúvatar revealed to him many wonder that had until then been hidden. And Eru Ilúvatar decreed that just after the first elves awoke, so too shall awake the thought of Yavanna, and in the forests shall walk the shepherds of the trees. So there you go, the very first Ents. And it's very possible indeed that among these first Ents was Treebeard. Gandalf tells us in the Two Towers that Treebeard is the oldest of all living things. Although, to be fair, Tom Bombadil does also claim the same distinction. But either way, Treebeard is an immensely ancient being, and we have every reason to believe that at this time he was just living happily in the forests of Middle-earth with his Ent wife, Fimbrethiel. Anyway, just before I go back to dwarves, there is one more race that I need to briefly mention. Because at the same time that Ilúvatar revealed the wonder that is Ents, the children of Yavanna, he also revealed to Manwë that he too would have beings of his own, but uniquely, these beings have the distinction of being allowed to awaken before the elves. And it probably won't surprise you that the children of Manwë, the king of the wind and skies, are of course the great eagles. Now, if you want to know a lot more about the eagles, I have a whole video specifically about them. I'll pop it in the link in the description to watch after. But what's cool to think about right now is that of the 5 main incarnate races to inhabit Middle-earth, that's not including orcs or hobbits, which are really just an offshoot of the race of men, it is actually the eagles who came first. But anyway, this is a video all about the Dwarves of Beleriand, and so without any further ado, let's take a look at the Broadbeams and the Firebeards. So these two clans are descended from the fathers that awoke in the Blue Mountains, and as you can see on the map, the Blue Mountains are right here on the eastern edge of Beleriand. Now, although Broadbeams and Firebeards are their technical names, throughout pretty much all of the Silmarillion, the two clans are instead referred to by the great dwarven cities that they hail from. The more northern of these two cities is called in the dwarven language Gabilgathol, although it is much more commonly known in the Sindarin tongue as Belegost. And the southern city is known in the dwarven tongue as Tumulzahar, and in the Sindarin as Nogrod. But what is a little bit strange here is that Tolkien never actually tells us whether it was the Firebeards in Belegost or the Broadbeams. Same with Nogrod. So although throughout the First Age, Nogrod and Belegost will become pretty distinct places, I can't actually tell you which one's populated by Broadbeams and which one's populated by Firebeards. However, what I can tell you about is a couple of the individual dwarves who really make a splash in the First Age. So I'll start with Nogrod, where we have a great craftsman called Gamilzirak. His name means silver spike in the dwarven Khuzdul language, and we're told that many of his works found their way into the treasury of the elven Grey King, Eleuthingol. However, despite the hype, we don't actually know of anything specific that Gamilzirak created. Instead, he is best known for being the teacher of a much more impressive dwarven craftsman called Telkar of Nogrod. So we're told that Telkar was one of the greatest dwarven smiths ever to live, and among his creations are 3 very important artifacts dating all the way back to the early First Age. Now, the first 2 of these artifacts you may not have heard of, but the third one I guarantee you have. So the first blade to be forged by Telkar that we hear about is called Angrist, which means the Iron Cleaver. And Angrist is a small dagger that honestly is not massively important right now, but it will become incredibly significant when I get to the tale of Beren and Luthien. However, for right now, what you need to know is that this dagger was given as a gift by Telkar to Curufin, the Crafty, the favourite son of Feanor, and an all-round really dodgy dude. Anyway, the second thing that Telkar is famous for forging is the dragon helm of Dolomine. Now, honestly, this also isn't that significant right now, and there'll be a decent chance you've not actually heard of it, but there is a very good chance that you have already seen a picture of it. So, if you've ever seen Tolkien's The Children of Húrin in bookstores, then you've definitely seen this dragon helm. In fact, it doesn't even matter which version, which edition you've seen, because the helm is front and center in pretty much all of them. So I'll get to the dragon helm in later videos too. But for now, all you need to know is that Telkar gave the helm to Maedhros, that's the eldest son of Feanor, and Maedhros in turn gave it as a gift to his beloved cousin, Fingon, the Lord of Dolomine. But by far the most famous of all of Telkar's creations is Narsil, the future sword of Elendil, the blade that was broken and used to cut the ring from Sauron's finger. However, the story of how Narsil gets from Telkar's smithy in Nogrod to Elendil's hand in Númenor thousands and thousands and thousands of years later is completely unknown. There is absolutely no mention of Narsil in the First Age, and it doesn't show up until we meet Elendil right at the end of the Second Age. But whatever went on behind the scenes, it is pretty cool to think that although Aragorn's sword Andúril was reforged by the Elves of Rivendell, it was actually initially forged by a lesser-known dwarf of the First Age called Telkar. Now, to be honest, the Dwarves of Belegost are even lesser known than the Dwarves of Nogrod. The most famous of all the Dwarves of Belegost, perhaps the only famous Dwarf of Belegost, is their king, who is called Azaghal. And Azaghal is very, very important, but he has a very specific role in a very specific battle that I'll get to later. But I guess the most significant thing that the Dwarves of Belegost and the Dwarves of Nogrod do to move the story forward is first encountering the Sindar under the kingship of Eleuthingol. So, long before the Noldor or even Morgoth returned to Beleriand, the Dwarves of Nogrod and Belegost made the acquaintance of the Grey King of all Beleriand and his Maya wife Melian. And the elves called the dwarves the Naugrim, which means the stunted people. A bit rude, I guess. Although, actually, despite that, this is the beginning of a very prosperous friendship between the two races. The dwarves famously traded objects of great value with the elves, and were even told that when Morgoth did eventually return and the first battle of Beleriand broke out, Eleuthingol was able to win the day due to the great dwarven weapons that were forged for his army. And this is a really significant theme of the Silmarillion, elves and dwarves working together to create things more wonderful than either race could make on their own. The finest example of this is Thingol's subterranean halls of Menegroth, although Finarod Felagund's realm of Nargothrond also demonstrates the same thing. And there's one other Noldorine lord who makes great profit from his relationship with the dwarves. And his name is Caranthir the Dark, the fourth son of Feanor. So despite Caranthir's reputation for being angry and aggressive, he alone of the sons of Feanor develops a really tight relationship with the dwarves. In fact, it was his people who were the first Noldor ever to encounter them, and Caranthir even built his realm right along the dwarf road, next to their great cities in the Blue Mountains. Although, I guess for the sake of telling the full story, I should point out that we're actually told Caranthir did not do this because he really liked the dwarves. In fact, we're specifically told he didn't like them. Tolkien wrote that no great love was there between them. For the dwarves were secret and quick to resentment, and Caranthir was haughty and scarce concealed his scorn for the unloveliness of the Naugrim. Which seems a bit harsh, to be honest, but I guess they make each other rich, so it's all okay. Anyway, this brings me to a potentially quite long, but hopefully interesting side note about the dwarves' use of language. Because you may very well be wondering, well, how did the elves and the dwarves communicate? Did the elves learn Kuzdul, or did the dwarves learn Sindarin? Well, actually, we have a very definite answer to this, and it involves a bit of a deep dive into the unique relationship that the dwarves have with their language, with Kuzdul. So, among Tolkien's many invented languages, Kuzdul really stands out. And that's because, unlike the Elvish and Mannish languages, and also every language in the real world today, Kuzdul was not actually created by the dwarves who spoke it. Instead, it was taught to them by their creator, Aule, who in the dwarven language they call Mahal. And so, Kuzdul is an incredibly sacred part of dwarven culture, and we're told that they taught it very carefully to their children to ensure that it wouldn't change or even evolve over time as other languages do. And this means that all dwarves speak the same language, regardless of where they happen to be in the world. But the other thing that's really interesting about Kuzdul is that the dwarves keep it so secret. Within their culture, Kuzdul is exclusively to be used by dwarves, and it is very rarely spoken to outsiders. And so, when dwarves communicate with non-dwarves, they're much happier to learn the other person's language than they are to teach them their own. And dwarves take this secrecy of language so far that they don't even share their true names with non-dwarves. For example, I don't actually know what Telkar's true name is. Telkar is not a Kuzdul word. Neither is Gimli, or Thorin, or Durin. The peoples of Middle-earth tells us that the name Durin means king in the language of the men of the north. And as I mentioned in the last video, most of the dwarf names from The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings are actually real-world Old Norse names. They are not Kuzdul. Now, in the First Age, there are a few exceptions. Both Gamil-Zirak and Azagal are actually Kuzdul names, and so are two of the Petty Dwarves, who I'll talk about in just a minute. But in the Second and the Third Ages, dwarves exclusively go by Mannish names, and they do this to preserve the secrecy and the sanctity of Kuzdul. In fact, in the War of the Jewels, we're even told about a type of dwarven sign language called Iglishmek that's used by dwarves so that they can communicate wordlessly when non-dwarves are present. That's how seriously they take the secrecy of Kuzdul. Although, despite what I've just said, I don't want to imply that we don't know any Kuzdul words. Tolkien does give us a common Kuzdul battle cry that goes Baruch Khazad, Khazad Menu. And that means, axes of the dwarves are upon you. And you may have heard this in any number of Middle-earth video games and other adaptations. And we do also know a handful of Kuzdul names that were given by dwarves to particularly special non-dwarves, namely Felakgundu for Finrod Felagund, and also Tharkun, which is what the dwarves will one day call Gandalf. And the dwarves do also name some significant places using their own language, such as the mountain Barazimbar, the valley Azanulbizar, and the chamber Mazabul, and of course the most famous of all, Khazad-dûm. Although I will say that most of these places are much more commonly known by their Sindarin names, such as Caradhras and Nandu-Hirion, and of course, in later days, Moria. But you may very well be thinking, well, Rainbow Dave, didn't you begin this video with a Kuzdul sentence? And the answer to that is yes, but also no. So what I said at the beginning of this video, and the last one too, is Gamut Sanu Yenet Dayamu Kujan Aimenu, which means something along the lines of good day and blessings of the ancestors upon you. But to be 100% honest, those aren't words that Tolkien himself invented, at least not all of them. You see, back when Peter Jackson was making the Lord of the Rings movies, the production hired a linguist called David Sallow to help with the reconstruction of Tolkien's invented languages. And because there is so little Khuzd-dûl to go off of, what David Sallow came up with is often called Neo-Khuzd-dûl. Now, don't get me wrong, David Sallow is a legit linguist, he certainly does know what he's talking about, but sentences like this are Neo-Khuzd-dûl. They're inspired by Tolkien, but the words aren't actually invented by him. And side note within a side note, you can actually hear the linguistic similarities between Gimli's insult in The Fellowship and Thorin's insult in The Hobbit.
We could go
Anyway, that was a massive tangent about language. Thanks for bearing with me. I'm afraid the truth is one simply can't talk about Tolkien without sometimes going off on massive tangents about language. But there is one more faction of dwarves that we meet in the Silmarillion who I do want to talk a little bit about. But these guys aren't really Broadbeams or Firebeards at all. You see, Tolkien tells us about a small group known as the Petty Dwarves, and by the time that our Noldarine exiles arrive in Beleriand, there aren't many Petty Dwarves left, but they are a very interesting detail. So, first thing to say about the Petty Dwarves is that by pretty much any definition, they are inferior to like the High Dwarves of Nogrod and Belagos, or any of the 7 clans really. And that's because the Petty Dwarves don't belong to any clan. They're outcasts, and they seem to have developed their own outcast society. So the Petty Dwarves of Beleriand were the first dwarves to leave the Blue Mountains, and the first to wander the lands of Beleriand. And it's during this time that they diminished, and they became physically smaller even than your average dwarf. Also, whereas the dwarves of Nogrod and Belagos are pretty sociable with the elves, the Petty Dwarves shun all peoples, and they are incredibly antisocial. Although, interestingly, the Petty Dwarves are an exception to that whole dwarves don't reveal their true names rule. In fact, every named Petty Dwarf in the entire story does use a Khuzd-dûl name. It's possible that might be part of the reason why they are outcasts. Anyway, the tale of the Petty Dwarves is a pretty sad one, because their lack of communication with the other sentient race of Beleriand results in a horrendous misunderstanding. So when the first Sindarin elves, the Dark Elves, settled in Beleriand during the long migration of the elves from Cuiviénen into the uttermost west, they never encountered any other sentient non-elven beings before. Well, apart from the Valar, of course, and also Ents, and potentially Orcs. But when the Dark Elves first encountered the Petty Dwarves, they found them aloof and unfriendly, and they assumed that dwarves must just be a type of animal. In fact, the Sindar called the Petty Dwarves Levayin Tadail, which literally means biped animals. And unfortunately, the main interaction that the Sindar had with animals of the forest was hunting them. So, naturally, the Sindar just sort of started shooting at the Petty Dwarves, and it wasn't until they eventually developed contact with the much more impressive dwarves of Belagos and Nogrod that the elves realized their mistake. These aren't animals, whoops! And by then, there weren't many Petty Dwarves left. So, great job, Sindar, literally hunting dwarves like animals. You're supposed to be the frickin' good guys. And although the Petty Dwarves aren't a massively significant part of the story, there is something interesting to think about here, because in later ages there is a very well-known animosity between elves and dwarves, and for the most part that animosity stems from one specific event that hasn't actually happened yet. But it involves the Sindar of Beleriand and the dwarves of the Blue Mountains. Now, during that event, there's definitely blame on both sides, but I think most people would agree that the dwarves do kind of come across as the villains in that altercation. But I would point out that from their perspective, one could certainly bring up this whole Petty Dwarves business in their defense. Long before the grievance that supposedly led to elves mistrusting dwarves, they were hunting them like beasts. Not cool. Anyway, I know I said that the Petty Dwarves aren't quite as impressive as the dwarves of Nogrod or Belagos, but that's not to say they didn't build anything. In fact, they did indeed build one particularly important settlement in the caves above the river Narog. This petty dwarven hall was called Nalukazdine. Although, interesting side note, in the 17th issue of the Parma Eldalamberon, by far the best issue, we're told that Tolkien later settled on the name Narukathun. So, yeah. Either way, the reason this Nalukazdine, or Narukathun, is important is because it brings us back up to date with the story in progress. Remember in the video before last, where I was talking about the underground elven realm of Nargothrond, the realm built by Finrod Felagund? Well, I said it was delved within an already existing, but now completely abandoned, dwarven ruin. That ruin is Nalukazdine. So I think that's worth bearing in mind. Finrod Felagund's super secret, super awesome realm exists inside the shell of what was originally built by these now almost, but not completely, extinct Petty Dwarves. Anyway, I guess that's probably a good place to finish, because chronologically we've now caught all the way back up to the 500-year-long siege of Angband. But to be honest, in the next video I'm going to jump all the way back in time again, because in addition to dwarves and elves, there is one other race of free peoples who are destined to leave a real significant stamp on the events of the First Age. In fact, in the next video, I'll talk about what is probably one of the most important events in the entire Legendarium: the coming of men. And so I'll talk all about the awakenings of men and all the different groups of men and their incredibly long journey from the uttermost east all the way into Beleriand. So to make sure you don't miss that, hit subscribe and leave a like or a comment below if you enjoyed this video. But, as always, until next time, my dear friends, much love, stay groovy, and Nevaya Melanine.